Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Jamie Lavin on the Government Innovation team at Bloomberg Philanthropies. We're coming together today to talk about how cities can expedite their deployment of state and local fiscal recovery funds. I think we all know the importance of using these direct, flexible federal funds well. And we want to show the federal government and the public that when they give cities direct funding, cities use it effectively and efficiently to improve the lives of their residents. But we also know that spending these funds is not easy. It comes with a lot of rules and regulation and reporting requirements, in addition to the processes that you as city leaders face every day in being able to spend funds. And so we want to talk about some of those challenges, what's making it hard to obligate and to spend these dollars, and what we can do. What are some strategies to be able to accelerate the pace of the obligation and spending? This conversation is a continuation of the Federal Assistance E311 program, which is a partnership between Bloomberg Philanthropies and the United States Conference of Mayors. And it's really about helping cities navigate the unprecedented federal funding that's been available, starting with FEMA funding to respond to COVID, HUD funding, CARES, and then ARPA, and now IJA and IRA. So I want to thank my colleagues, Rose Gill and Adam Freed of Bloomberg Associates, and our partners at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, including Dave Gatton, David Burns, and Paige Sterling. And this program is sort of a one of a kind. We've retained federal funding experts to help cities navigate issues from what are the eligible uses of these funds to what are the controls you should put in place to make sure that you prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. So today you're going to hear from two of our experts. You're going to hear from Matt Hansen of Witt O'Brien and Thomas Leatherby of Hagerty Consulting. And as a reminder, you can schedule one-on-one time with our experts to walk through your questions and get answers. And my colleagues will put in the chat the link to be able to request that support. You can also continue to send in your questions through our website. And as a reminder, all the questions that have been submitted to date, as well as the answers from our experts, are posted on our website. So if you have a question, we encourage you to go there and see if someone else has had the same question and it's already been answered. We continue to update that site. There's a lot of new information that's been added in just the last few weeks. And since the program launched in May of 2021, we've had over 6,500 different city practitioners join us from over 1,500 cities. Last year, we expanded our work to the Local Infrastructure Hub, which is about helping cities navigate the unprecedented funding through IJA and now IRA to help move forward infrastructure projects to be able to develop competitive, ambitious programs and win that funding and really deliver results, including on your climate goals, on your racial equity goals. So now I want to jump into the conversation. So I'm going to pull Matt and Tom in, and I encourage, as I said, if you just joined us, please, as we're talking, pop your questions into the chat, raise your virtual hands. This is a discussion, this is a dialogue. There's no set presentation, and we want this to answer whatever challenges you're having. If it's even just saying, I'm having the same problem, there can be support in numbers and being able to reach out to a colleague in another city and talk about how they're grappling with these issues. So the first question I thought we would start with is really about the debt ceiling negotiations. I think we all had a little bit of our hearts in our throats as clawbacks were being discussed. And so, Matt, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little bit of a state of play about the safety of this money, where the debt ceiling negotiations concluded with the agreement, and just letting cities know the state of play with respect to their SLFRF funds.
Sure, Jamie, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. You know, the great thing about a program like ARPA, State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, is it's brand new. It allows us to do lots of innovative things. The bad thing about a program like the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund is it's brand new, and we're all trying to figure out the rules as we go along. This was very clear during the debt ceiling debate, where people were trying to take their experience from past negotiations and apply it to the ARPA funding. What was sort of lost in translation was the money had already been obligated by the federal government, had already been awarded, and the funding had actually been dispersed. It was not sitting with Treasury to be dispersed, it's actually sitting with state, county, and local governments. So the reality of a clawback where they were actually going to have local non-entitlement units and other jurisdictions cut checks back to Treasury was really never on the table. The good news is, we're past that. It created a lot of confusion and angst, as Jamie mentioned. We saw one of two things happen, and neither was particularly healthy. One was just a complete and utter shutdown of activity. People were afraid to make decisions. People were afraid to move forward with projects, signing contracts, issuing additional subrecipient agreements, making payments, because they were hearing from congressional delegations and others that there is the potential that the money was coming back. So certainly, put at least a 3-month delay on some of the expending of funds. The other thing we saw, which in my opinion was even more problematic, was people deviating from what was a very well thought out expenditure plans that their jurisdictions had, doing really quick maneuvers, hoping to meet obligations and expenditure deadlines. So deviating from internal controls, deviating from spending plans, trying to react to what they thought was the potential for losing the money, and really ultimately, opens up a jurisdiction for finding question costs down the road. Now that we have the deal in place, and we know that the state and local fiscal recovery funding, as well as almost all the IIJA and all the IRA funding is safe, jurisdictions can take a breath, and really encourage folks to get back to their previously established expenditure plans, and really make sure they follow through now with what their plans were, that they're not reacting to a potential clawback. We're not over this situation completely. There are caps on federal agencies, so we're going to hear the same sort of debate in future fiscal years about certain federal agencies having to rescind program funding or scaling back training and technical assistant resources. It's just kind of the political environment we're in. I would just encourage folks to stick with your plan, stick with your process, stick with your internal controls, and try to block out the noise as best as possible.
I think that's helpful. I do think, I hope the one silver lining of having the clawbacks in the news was that it did cause cities, I think, to think to themselves, I need to move a little more quickly. And there's good reason to think that cities should be trying to get these funds into action as quickly as they can. Why don't we just first tackle what are the deadlines to get this money out, so that cities have that at least as the framework for when they absolutely must obligate and spend these funds by. And I think there's a little confusion because of the way Treasury has talked about obligations, about what that means.
Sure. So, the first thing I would make sure is every jurisdiction sort of unpacks the difference between obligation and encumbrance from a pure accounting perspective and obligation from a federal grant perspective. We're hearing a lot of confusion, especially around like employee payroll, that personnel costs are not encumbered or obligated until the actual payroll for that pay period is cleared. That is an accounting concept. That's not a grant concept. So have some internal conversations about, what an obligation, what a commitment of funding means from a federal grant perspective. That's sort of step one. So the obligation deadline is, as I think everybody on this call can probably, quote chapter and verses 12/31/24. Historically, an obligation means a contract, subrecipient issue, PO, that sort of thing. Treasury has in their FAQs expanded upon that and specifically addressed how Obligations can be broader than that. They can be a funding commitment. And that funding commitment can be, a council resolution. It can be an expenditure plan. There are lots of different versions of what a funding commitment and obligation can be. So that's sort of the next step, is make sure your jurisdiction has documented what a definition of an obligation means to you all. It could mean city manager approval. It could mean city council approval. It could be a budget resolution, whatever that is, have that definition. It does not necessarily have to be a contract issued or a subrecipient award made. From that point, you have until 12/31/26 to both expend and liquidate. So unlike many other federal grants where you have a closeout period beyond the project end date, project closeout periods are 30, 60, 90 days, allowing you to liquidate those final expenditures. As of right now, we don't have that. 12/31/26 is the date. Are we guessing that Treasury is going to make some adjustments to these like they did with the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund? Yes. Have they done it to date? No. So 12/31/26 is your vendor's deadline, your subrecipient's deadline, and also your deadline. So think strategically about backing up those agreements. Having subawards end 9/30/26, have contracts end, end of August 2026, to give you all enough internal time to do final reporting, closeout, liquidation of invoices, all those sorts of things, so that you're wrapped up by the 12/31/26. The other thing you really need to keep in mind right now is beyond 12/31/24, there is no additional obligation period. So if you obligate for a project that for some reason doesn't happen or comes in under budget, or you have a project that earns program income, that program income gets tacked onto your award. If any of those actions happen after 12/31/24, you don't have the ability to re-obligate that money. So think about, over obligating, thinking about other types of projects where you might be able to do ledger transfers, backing out GF with the ARPA funding. But most importantly, really, look at those projects critically between now and 12/31/24 to see if any of them just aren't going to happen. They're not on track. They're not meeting timelines, or you have any questions at all, so you can take corrective action while you're still have the ability to re-obligate funds. And Tom, anything you want to add to it?
No, Matt, I think those are some really good points. And the issue of over-obligating funds is one I've been talking to a lot of people about. We have been looking at program design, especially for some of these programs that they're just coming online now, or even haven't come online yet, and looking at how budgets are always in flux and how are those budgets going to be handled as we approach the obligation deadline. And I'm urging that there's flexibility built in, that period of performances on subawards are increased so that we can have some flexibility to spend any under budget. That sometimes there's not a whole lot of reward for efficiency in this scenario. So want to make sure that the project itself can expend the funds if that's where they're obligated.
And we've been really focused on the deadline so far, making sure that this money actually goes to use. But I think there's other good reasons why we want to see cities putting this money into action. Can maybe Tom, you can start here. What are some of the strategic and policy reasons that a city should be moving this money into action more quickly?
Well, I mean, let's start with budget for the first, with cost. We're seeing fairly significant inflation right now, even more so on construction projects, capital expenses. So spending money now is going to be more efficient than spending money down the line. For construction projects and other capital expenses, I think a lot of recipients have underestimated some of the compliance and permitting hurdles that need to go on. And we're getting awfully close to that obligation deadline to be starting a project right now that may have even a modified NEPA review that goes along with it, or that may need a Section 404 permit from the Corps of Engineers, or that may need a detailed floodplain development permit. So I think that that's where we get into a discussion of an initial spending plan may have obligated or may have intended money to go toward a capital project. That capital project's been delayed. It's not ready to go out to bid yet. That's a good discussion to have about, can we swap this money for a shovel-ready project and use other local funding to fund the project that's not quite ready at this point. Getting the funds out the door is probably going to become increasingly more important as we get closer to the obligation deadline than necessarily using them for their intended purpose. The really important thing for local governments to worry about is how you message that, though, right? Because you can't have a particular constituency that lobbied for a particular project during the initial stakeholder outreach and allocation phase have the impression that their project's being taken away. We saw that a lot in this run up to the debt ceiling negotiations when, and I really appreciate the way Matt put it, that local governments may have made some unadvisable moves. And it was rather unfortunate that there had to be that sort of a scramble, because there were funds moved around and a lot of entities that maybe thought that they had a voice in the process, but their project was pushed off and wasn't funded with the first tranche of funding, or wasn't funded in the initial round of projects that a city got subrecipient agreements out the door for. And they feel like they may have had their projects taken away. It's definitely something to manage on the local level in terms of communication and some of the politics behind it.
Matt, I think that's such a good point that Tom's raising, and we'll come back to that on that sort of the community engagement piece. Are there other, policy and strategic reasons you should want to get this money into action as quickly as possible?
Sure. So local control, local decision-making, and programmatic flexibility. So for folks on this call who have worked in the federal funding space for a while, you've all run into the scenario where you're trying to fund a project and the project doesn't quite align with the funding available, or you really know that a program needs an additional, wraparound service to be effective, but the funding doesn't allow it from an allowability perspective. This is really, an unprecedented pot of money that gives local governments, almost exclusive control over how the money is spent, especially under revenue loss. So the ability to address those critical issues in your community and address them the way you and your stakeholders think they need to be addressed, providing all of the wraparound services that these programs desperately need, that really kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity with the ARPA. So to see that funding sitting on the shelf in many jurisdictions is really disappointed. It's sort of a dream scenario. I've also heard, too many jurisdictions talk about sort of taking the path of least resistance. I have a flood control project. I have a water project. It's already in the works. I'm going to spend the money there. I understand that, taking that path of least resistance, but this is really a historic opportunity to, address critical issues within your community and using, the most flexible funding stream we've probably ever seen. I also don't think folks with the inflationary pressure we're under right now really realize the benefit of not having some of the Davis-Bacon National Environmental Policy Act and some of the typical federal flow down requirements applying. For those of you that have ever contracted out a Davis-Bacon project, that your vendors just automatically tack on 20% to the cost. So to strategically target some medium or smaller infrastructure projects that otherwise might not be financially viable, this is really an incredible opportunity to do that as well.
That's really helpful. I think one other point that we've previously discussed is I know a lot of the cities on this call are applying for discretionary infrastructure grant funding. And, you know, I've had conversations with USDOT that when they are thinking about which cities to fund or which projects to fund, one of the things they're thinking about is feasibility, right? Like, is this project going to happen? And if a city is sitting on most of its ARPA allocation, it's going to go into their assessment as to whether or not that's going to be one of the projects they decide to award a discretionary grant to. In terms of, I see a question in the chat about obligated. Tom or Matt, are you guys able to tackle that? I can read the question out. It's really about, you know, so Treasury has said that your local guidelines rule the day on what obligation means. Does that mean, as Joanne has asked, that if the city council was to pass something that says that, you know, obligation means XYZ, that will be sufficient?
Yeah, so I'd specifically refer them to FAQ 13.17 in the Treasury FAQs. And it talks about these alternative approaches to obligation. So, you know, define what obligation means for you, for your jurisdiction, consistently utilize that, and that will be sufficient for Treasury oversight, auditor oversight. It can be, like we mentioned, it can be, you know, council resolution. It can be whoever has the authority to make those funding decisions. I think historically, everybody would say, you know, you have to have a contract issued, a subaward awarded, a PO. And while those are great, you know, things to have in place, they're not the requirement for meeting the obligation deadline of 12/31/24.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Matt. I will say, excuse me, this has gotten a little bit trickier and a little bit muddier with 6.1 projects, with revenue loss projects, because by their very nature, you don't have that subaward to fall back on. You don't have some of the project documentation to fall back on. So the question of how we document the existing of the existence of the obligation and when the obligation actually occurred has been something we've talked about a lot internally at Hagerty. So one strategy a lot of governments looked into around the time of the debt ceiling was to use available revenue loss to essentially reimburse their general fund for large pools of expenditure, you know, employee health costs maybe, or some old payroll costs, something that could be easily aggregable, easily definable, that met the criteria of provision of government services. And the question is, and then they were going to use the resulting money offset in the general fund to fund the SLFRF priorities they had originally planned. The question is, when would that obligation occur? Would it occur at the time of the budget transfer, at the time of the journal entry? Would there need to be some sort of action beyond that? And there are a lot of questions there that were really good questions around revenue loss. We could give what we thought was a very well-supported answer, but this is all new. We've never seen this tested in an audit before. There is no guidance that's directly on point. So my advice is always backing up an obligation with the most documentation possible is going to leave you in the best place.
And I would just say, you know, to Tom's examples, yes to all of those, you know, whether it's the ledger transfer, whether it's the budget action, whether it's the council action directing for the, you know, the funds to be swapped. That's, you know, documenting that process. And then if that process is done again and again, you know, be consistent and replicate that same process. So yeah, it's new territory with any of this. I mean, certainly it's new territory with the allowability, where Treasury is requiring jurisdictions to make those allowability determinations on their own. Document, be consistent, look for safe harbors. You know, that's all the what we're all working under right now. Jamie, I did see another question as far as spending the ARPA funding as soon as possible. We're all operating under the same rules. So whether it's pass-through money from the state or direct from Treasury, the obligations and expenditure deadlines could be more restrictive, but they can't be less restrictive. So a state or county pass-through might, require the money be obligated and expended sooner than 12/31/24 and 12/31/26, but they do not have any authority to allow it to be used longer. With the one caveat, I know there's this term of ARPA-like or ARPA facilitated money, which is this general fund that was freed up. But you should know that in whatever flow down requirement you received, whether you're actually getting, federal ARPA money or you're getting general fund or some other money that, might have been freed up or facilitated because of ARPA. But yeah, the sense of urgency should be there with all the funding, regardless of source.
And the only thing to worry about, especially with some of that pass-through money where your government entity is actually functioning as a subrecipient of the state, like with workforce money, for example, we've seen that a lot, is if you are going to accelerate the expenditure, make sure it's consistent with the program budget that you have in that subrecipient agreement.
I think we saw a strong example of that strategy you talked about, Tom, in Tampa in May, where Tampa moved some of the money that they were going to spend on housing. They spent it on police and public safety salary by a budget resolution passed by their city council to make sure that the funds were spent on time, and now they'll use general service revenue for the housing project. And I wanted to start turning to some of the questions we received before the event. And so I'm going to pull Ahmad Rivera-Wagner from Green Bay into this conversation because he raised an issue that I think is probably plaguing almost every city on the call. Ahmad, are you on?
Yep. Hi, Jamie. How are you?
Hey, good.
This has been absolutely incredibly informative. So thank you, Matthew and Tom. Very, very helpful. So we're having all of the many challenges that people are talking about that you've discussed in the chat. But part of our big challenge is actually internal capacity. And so being able to move, many people know this, we obviously have a common council. We often have to negotiate the purse strings and how these things get moved. So building up the internal capacity of both our finance department and our department heads, as well as the lone person who's charged with being essentially the internal auditor of our ARPA funds, has been a major challenge to help align everyone in the government to understand deadline. They understand deadlines, but what they can spend, how they can get it done, then dealing with the politics of the council, and then obviously making sure that we can actually enact these projects, which often requires us to hire more people to help implement the programming. And so we just have an internal capacity challenge that we're running into where we are just not moving fast enough, even with the old schedule. And then when the debt ceiling debate happened, absolutely put us into disarray for many folks who were at various stages of their project. So just trying to figure out in a way, how can we uptrain department staff, finance staff, and then ultimately how to translate that into public communications to really ensure that people get the nature of this. Like one major thing that has caused a lot of people confusion is the revolving loan aspects for affordable housing and whether we can do those or not. And so these are just places where very few people have this knowledge. Bloomberg has been one of the few places in the country who's been really articulate around these types of issues, but not everyone can make those. So just trying to figure out how do we build internal capacity to streamline approval, and are there good models or are there ways to move us so that we can accelerate all of our implementation? Because as you said, past 2024, we cannot reallocate.
Well, I can start. So let me start by saying this. It doesn't matter what size your city is, everyone's in the same boat. Because it could be the largest city and the largest finance department in the country, and It could be the smallest city where the half-time employee is the city clerk and the dog catcher and reads the water meters. And everyone's really in the same boat. We're talking about unprecedented federal funding. We're talking about coming out of a pandemic, so staffing levels already took a hit to begin with. We're talking about it being nearly impossible to hire qualified employees right now. Just as impossible to retain qualified employees. We're all in a position where a lot of our internal knowledge has retired, and the pandemic accelerated that. So let's start with, nobody should feel any sort of deficiency for being in that position, because every city in the entire country is there. And the only cities that say they're not are probably missing some pretty key compliance elements in their infrastructure. I will say that you highlighted talking about revolving funds and capitalizing revolving funds. In my opinion, that is the single most difficult issue in the entirety of ARPA compliance. It is incredibly complicated, especially if you're trying to use one of the negative economic impact eligibilities as opposed to using revenue loss. I don't think it's from a program design point of view, I think there are serious issues with even conceptualizing a revolving fund not using revenue loss, because of the way you have to then account for program income and how the obligation period would come into play. But suffice it to say, you've highlighted the very hardest issue. But getting to the heart of your question, SLFRF funds themselves allow you a number of different ways to augment your capacity. So you've got EC7, you can hire help to do it, right? And then you've got the public sector capacity enhancement. You can hire full-time employees, you can hire temporary employees, you can use retention bonuses, maybe, kind of, sorta. Have to play around a little bit of that given the end of the public health emergency, but there's still some ways to get around that. But what you have is not an eligibility question. What you have is a political question. You have to convince the decision makers that it's a fair use of this funding to administer this funding. And that's a hard sell, because there was a pool of money, and the pool of money started being divided, and now the pool of money is dwindling, and you have to make that. You just have to make that point. And there are lots of strategies that I've heard that have been effective with city councils before. One of them is to point out that a subrecipient would be allowed a 10% de minimis indirect cost threshold. So, why are we as the city essentially being allowed 0.0025% to administer this grant? That's a pretty fair argument. Another is to say Treasury built in an entire eligibility category for administration. We should be using that money proportionately to what we're doing with these projects. You can look around. There are several data sources that allow you to compare EC7 expenses to overall expenses. You can pull some recovery plan reports and use that to build the case. But probably the best case is we were just all scared of rescissions, whether that was a fair point or not, we were. And we were just all, and now we've got the obligation deadline coming up. Do we want to be in a position of handing some of this money back, or having an audit come back saying that we used some of this money inappropriately because we were scrambling at a deadline?
So I would like to add, or I would like to challenge what the goal is a little bit. So in my opinion, the goal is not to get to 12/31/26 and fully expend and liquidate the ARPA funds. The goal is, what do we want the grants enterprise of our jurisdictions to look like 5 years, 10 years from now? And the ARPA funding creates an incredible opportunity to invest in that internal grants management capacity, so that the community not only can fully take advantage of the ARPA funds, but can also take advantage of IIJA, IRA, and everything else that's coming down the pike. So, Jamie and Tom will probably kick me under the table for two very different reasons. But take advantage of Bloomberg, take advantage of the offerings, because what you're looking for is not new. So if you need, policies and procedures, if you need collateral, if you need questions asked, if you need staff training that can be done through a one-on-one consultation, the items you're looking for are no different than items that other folks on this call are looking for, and really, the purpose of what Bloomberg's trying to accomplish. So, let's leverage the materials that have already been developed. Let's get them deployed. Let's get staff trained. Let's figure out where staff needs to be augmented, and build a high functioning grants enterprise for your community for the next 10 years, and use this moment in time through the philanthropic resources, through admin, through indirect costs, through investments in public sector capacity, through revenue loss, all these tools we have at our disposal to accomplish that. And one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is use cooperative purchasing. We're seeing a lot of people getting hung up on procurement, RFPs taking too long. Something states are really good at is using cooperative purchasing programs. Some jurisdictions are better than others, but really, look at that as one, administrative easy button, especially right now as we're getting up against the obligation deadline. But really, let Bloomberg know what you and the staff needs and how we can help the jurisdiction.
And I won't kick Matt. We want that, right? So we, as Matt has talked about, there's a lot of infrastructure opportunity, and it's the same people often who are having to deploy these ARPA funds and having to apply for IJA grants, and then if you get them, deal with the performance of those. And so it only will inure to your benefit if you develop that capacity now. And I hear everyone when they say we don't want to put one-time funding into payroll costs, right? Because you don't want to have a cliff that you're coming off of. So what I've heard from Matt and Tom and others is there is a business case to be made there about the return on investment, right? And so I think that we can work with you and with other cities on the call to figure out what that business case looks like when people invest in their grants management capacity. What does that look like for how much grant funding you then are able to effectively get? What are you able to retain because you have the right compliance framework in place? And then I think there's a lot of value in thinking about what is that. If you need just temporary capacity right now to get through some of that, maybe it's contract, maybe it's fellows. I put in the chat a link to a document the Treasury recently published on how cities are bolstering their municipal capacity with ARPA, and I'll give a lot of different strategies. Cities are doing different things here, and so those are some of the ways that you can do it. And then I agree with Tom, there's the communications piece, and so maybe just coming back to the communications piece, and then Kenneth, I promise we're gonna get to your question. What I wanted to just talk through a little bit with you, Tom, and with Matt, is that piece about we encouraged everyone to do a lot of community engagement around how to spend this money. We focused on cities who were doing surveys, and they were going out and they were doing workshops and really soliciting and trying to uncover all the people who don't normally get funding, right? And make sure that this is, going to go to the right providers in the most underserved neighborhoods. But that also takes time. And now we're up against the clock. And so there is this tension that's happening. And how can you, if you were thinking about funding something maybe with a provider who's going to take longer to onboard because they don't have capacity themselves, how should you think about moving the money quickly and also sort of investing in the ways that the community has asked you to invest and you've told them you would?
So I think there's a couple things. There's one is look at opportunities to separate from the federal flow down requirements. So investing in some of those organizations with revenue loss dollars or with freed up general fund. I think there's opportunities to scale back projects. Certainly this is the opportunity to invest in that capacity of the organization, but instead of a $5 million, 4-year project, now it might be a 18-month, $1 million project, something more manageable. There are universities and major nonprofits who are willing to serve as fiduciaries. So there might be a partnering or a mentoring where you fund one organization who will work with the other nonprofit and really help them through the process with internal controls and financial. So there are those options. But the other is just the realization that if you're going to make some of these investments, which are incredibly valuable investments, they have to come with capacity development resources as well. Most federal grant programs, when they're brand new, there is an allocation of grant money, but there's also a separate training and technical assistance piece. And cities need to think in that same context that, we're going to roll out a grant award to this jurisdiction, but we're also going to invest, $25,000 or $50,000 in training, technical assistance, and capacity development, whether that's being done by, city staff or an outside vendor. One of the real lessons learned with the CARES Act CRF was too many very small first-time recipients received money, were not prepared, and those situations didn't turn out very well. But upfront support, upfront training, capacity development, separation from as many of the federal flow down requirements as possible, and then maybe rethinking the size and scope are some things that cities should be thinking through right now.
I think communication's key too. In one jurisdiction, we had a huge stakeholder group that was pushing for some flood control improvements, and not giant projects, but detention pond cleanouts and nuisance flooding removal. And we had originally allocated $2 million of SLFRF funding to do this, what were essentially deferred maintenance. But instead, we were able to reallocate that money, that most of that $2 million, to grant writing and non-federal match for stormwater projects. It still met the same needs. It allowed the local government to triple or quadruple their total investment size on grants that they were going to get. But that had to be communicated to those stakeholders. But that's fine, because that communication became the foundation for them generating letters of support and becoming stakeholders in the grant process. It has to be an open discussion, though, because if they see a council agenda that has a budget resolution that moves that money from the detention pond clean out project to paying some consultant, then they're not going to be able to, or they're not going to understand the story behind it. And that's when you get the pitchforks coming to the city council meeting. And we all wanted to avoid that.
Definitely. That's really helpful. In terms of, I'm going to pull one of our other city representatives into the conversation to talk a little bit about the shifting compliance requirements. Megan, are you on?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, great.
So thank you guys for doing this. This is super helpful. I know it's been said before, but I do think it's important to repeat it. We have absolutely had here in Fort Wayne all of the same issues that everybody else has had. So we are in this uniquely unfortunate position that we were just over the population threshold to be put into that higher tier reporting requirement. But we didn't have here in our city much history at all of receiving or managing federal grants. So there was a very quick learning curve for a lot of us. So we had that sort of unique internal issue. And that then fell within the context of, several different issues. So obviously we know like very little assistance from the Treasury with most federal grants. There's at least a program manager. They have none. We made the decision early in our process to, in good faith, get as much of this money out into our community as possible. So we created a grant program and ended up awarding 93 grants to different community organizations. I would say very confidently that less than 10 of those organizations had any experience managing federal grants. We know for sure that less than 5 of those 93 had experience directly receiving federal funds. And even those that did received federal funds from agencies that were much more prepared to manage a grant from the federal level on down. We've also had a lot of issues where we have found lack of agreement between Treasury's compliance and reporting requirements in their own guidance and OMB's guidance, particularly in the compliance supplements. And that includes the compliance supplement that was just released a few weeks ago. So we have all of that going on. And then we have had issues with the changing requirements. So obviously we had the final rule, which instituted massive changes. We have quarterly project and expenditure report changes from the Treasury that we are lucky to get a couple weeks notice on. A lot of times those changes are retroactive, which is very frustrating to try to comply with. We are sort of avidly waiting right now for any annual report changes for the annual report here due in 6 weeks. Just last quarter, we had huge challenges with the UEI requirement change with our project and expenditure report, and trying to then institute that change with so many subrecipient organizations who had never even, for example, been on the sam.gov website, and just literally navigating 93 different organizations through that was a huge challenge when we were already trying to navigate our quarterly reporting for them. So we've got all of that going on. And then we have this sort of constant anxiety of, what are the auditors going to ask for? The auditors don't seem to agree with what Treasury is saying is going to happen. We also are unsure of to what degree Treasury may be performing programmatic audits in the future. Right now, we're just dealing with our single audit, which is very, financial focused. So we've got all of that going on. It creates a lot of anxiety that we may have findings. So I guess I'm looking for your advice or your comment on how you think or how you feel those sort of really unique and I would say amplified compliance issues may be dealt with from OMB or Treasury, and sort of how then prime recipients should prepare for that. So to kind of give an example of that, there was a feeling early on that because of how difficult it would be to be compliant from beginning to end with these funds and these projects, that Treasury or OMB or auditors might go easy on us. I haven't felt that that's necessarily going to be the case, but I have heard that repeatedly. And so I guess I just wanted your perspective on if that's actually the case, and if not, how we should prepare for that.
So yeah, you have done a great job of summing up everybody's angst. Treasury will do programmatic monitoring reviews. They are still working on CARES CRF reviews, so it's not if they're going to do it, it's when they're going to do it. And Megan, I will let you know right now, you will have findings, and you will likely have question costs, but that's okay. And I think there's this narrative out there about clawbacks that, the Treasury is going to come in, the auditors are going to come in, they're going to find something, and they're going to make you pay back money. And that's not how, federal grants work, really. Certainly if there's a criminal activity, if there's waste, fraud, and abuse, you have to pay it back. If there's a finding or question cost over a compliance environment or internal control, the process is that you're given an opportunity to provide more information. It's a back and forth sort of debate. You eventually might get to the point where you agree to disagree, and they write up and there's a finding with a question cost. you're given the opportunity to do a ledger transfer to move that question cost onto something that would be allowable. So there's really never a situation outside of a criminal activity where there's an actual payback of funding to the federal government. FEMA, public assistance, the disaster world, very different situation. People pay back money all the time. The Treasury ARPA funding is much more the traditional grant world where that's an anomaly. I have a timeline of every single piece of Treasury guidance when it was issued, so that I know if I made a decision on March 4th, 2022, this is the context in which I made that decision. And so timeline, documentation, the context in which the decision was made was critical. At the end of the day, consistent application of guidance is huge. What the feds really look for is arbitrary and capricious decision-making, where you deviated from internal processes, and that deviation is not documented. There's no explanation for it. I really admire the grant program you did, but the realities are now very much sinking in for you. If a risk assessment, a traditional risk assessment, was not done up front, I would strongly consider doing a risk assessment at this point and looking to see, if any of those subawards need to be clawed back, if some of the subrecipients need an influx of capacity support now. It might get to the point where you need to back out the federal funds with revenue loss funds or freed up general funds because you have some subrecipients who just aren't ever going to be able to meet the federal standards. But those are all things you should be doing now. But at the end of the day, whether it's with our auditors, Treasury program staff, Treasury OIG, GAO staff, whoever comes looking, documentation and consistent application of policies and procedures is really what we're going to have to lean on.
When Matt and I agree so congruently, we're probably on to something. And my questions for you, Megan, were going to be, how much was your total award? You said you were just over the threshold of being an NEU. How much did you award to this large amount of subrecipients? Did you do a risk assessment, and how is monitoring going? And then based on how you answered those questions, I was going to ask you why you haven't reclassified the entire award as revenue loss. Because this is the time to be thinking about, not necessarily doing it, but thinking about the cost benefit. What compliance hurdles do I overcome if I move this project to revenue loss, or if I move these subrecipients to revenue loss and they're no longer subawards that have to be monitored? It's not cheating, it's using the guidance to your benefit. And there are going to be some circumstances where, especially if you have subrecipients who were very unsophisticated and hadn't even been to SAM.gov, like you said, that you could be in a situation where applying a proper risk assessment leads you to believe that maybe they should not be subrecipients anymore. So
sorry, I was just going to go ahead and answer your questions, if that's okay. So our total funds received were 50.8 million. So our population's 257,000. So it was just over that 250 threshold to that top tier reporting. We did do a pretty extensive risk assessment of each of our recipients. We also designed a process per Treasury guidance to designate grantee organizations as either beneficiaries or subrecipients, and then design different processes for compliance monitoring for depending on which category they fell into. It's actually gone surprisingly well. We always have a handful that we call our problem children that we need to give a little more help to. But we really have gone to great lengths to provide a lot of assistance to our grantee organizations. We do office hours every week with them. They each get as much one-on-one time as they need. We actually wrote an entire federal grant compliance manual for our subrecipients to make sure that they knew what they needed to do. We provided all of the forms, walked through everything step by step. how to do a suspension and debarment check, how to do a cost principal analysis. So it's been a very heavy lift, very seriously.
I will say that in the process of doing risk assessments, that became 90% subrecipient technical assistance and 10% risk assessment throughout many different jurisdictions. So there were a lot of organizations that were worthy organizations to put money out on the street very quickly that just had no idea of the compliance hurdles that they were going to have thrown at them. The ones that could be classified as beneficiaries, that was a gift, but the subrecipients out there, that's more problematic going forward.
Nick, and thank you so much. We're running a little short on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a poll up while I ask my next question. And I'll start with you, Tom. And if people need to drop at 5 on the dot, feel free to. We might let the discussion go on a little further if we have a few more questions. So Tom, I was going to ask, just getting to sort of some of the things we've touched on, are there additional strategies that cities can pursue in the procurement process to ensure expedited ARPA fund expenditure? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I think that procurement is a heavy hurdle for a lot of cities, and sometimes it's made out to be a little bit more difficult than it is. At the end of the day, we sort of advise kind of an internal analysis of how difficult is this procurement going to be, and it follows a little bit of a standard flow. First of all, can we accomplish this procurement with some sort of an existing mechanism, whether that's a state contract, whether that's a cooperative purchasing agreement, whether that's an existing contract, because that's the easiest way to go about it. Secondly, can we make this work given our purchasing, for whatever jurisdiction we're talking with, given the purchasing requirements, we've already vetted those purchasing requirements to make sure that they're consistent with all appropriate federal requirements. And then can we go through the process of making sure that contracts are amended with all necessary language? And then third, and this generally happens when somebody comes to us and says, by the way, here's a contract we entered into a while back, and now we want to use SLFRF money to pay for this project. And that's where we start talking about revenue loss.
Matt, do you have anything to add?
Always start with piggybacking on another contract using cooperative purchasing, state procurement, and then back into an RFP. Too many people are starting with step one is the drafting of an RFP. Also remember that the federal procurement standards are for formal procurement, and formal procurement can mean lots of different things. It doesn't necessarily have to mean RFP. You can still do, under certain circumstances, competition and practical, sole sourcing, emergency procurement, but in general, cooperative purchasing. And for the large municipalities that are on this call, think about being in a position where you're offering the cooperative procurement, either through an existing program where you sponsor the procurement, or establishing your own contracts that other jurisdictions can piggyback on as a potential revenue source. Most of the jurisdictions on this call are certainly large enough to be leading those efforts, because there are some very strategic organizations around the country who make quite a lot of money annually on hosting procurement programs. So
great. So I know that cities have more questions, and so I would just encourage you, as Matt said, we're here. I will put in the chat, the email if you want to reach out to schedule an office hour call. I just want to thank everyone. Thank Tom and Matt for answering so many questions today. This is a topic that I think we're going to continue having questions about, and so want to just encourage you all to also share with each other, because obviously this is a topic of shared concern between cities. You're all going through this together. As Tom said, there's really nothing to be embarrassed about if your capacity is not where you want it to be. Know that every city is dealing with that. the number one issue that we hear. And just wanted to remind you all that this is also part of a greater initiative, the Local Infrastructure Hub, and we have some events coming up in the next couple of weeks on a bunch of different funding opportunities. So I'm going to put in the chat the calendar of events. Love for you to share that. If you're not the person who's leading on infrastructure opportunities, please share it with your colleagues who are. We're going to be directly addressing the PROTECT program, which is about transportation resilience, looking at some of the direct pay provisions in IRA. I'm going to have Treasury on for that, our friends at Treasury. And we are also going to be talking with our tech and innovation colleagues about some of the initiatives that won SMART funding, and they're really about how to get data and be able to manage who's on your streets and getting the curb space that we know can be so prized in cities. So just want to thank you all again. Thank you for participating. Please reach out to us with questions. We're here, as Matt and Tom said, to help. So thank you all, and good luck with your spending.